Hoy vamos a hablar de la amapola y del opio. Sorry, today we're going to talk about opium.
Damn.
Historically, opium was made by making cuts in the unripe seed pods of the opium poppy Papaver somniferum. This would produce a latex that would then dry and could be collected. That's why opium is also called poppy tears. This latex contains several alkaloids, morphine being the one with the greatest concentration at around 10%. Other important alkaloids are codeine and thebaine, the latter of which is used as a precursor for semi-synthetic opioids such as oxycodone and hydromorphone. The earliest written record of opium is from Sumeria, where opium poppies were called plant of joy, and opium itself being called joy. If you've done even the smallest amount of research on opium before, you know that this is a totally unique and original way of introducing the topic, and nobody has used this factoid as an attention grabber before. In medicine, opium has been mentioned in the most important medical texts of the ancient world, including the Ebers Papyrus, an old Egyptian scroll from 1500 BCE, in which opium was used for, and I shit you not, to keep children from excessive crying. What is more disturbing is that desperate parents kept on drugging their kids until the beginning of the 20th century, when people finally realized that drugging your kids is a bad idea. Hippocrates, Aristotle, and Galen from ancient Greece all mention opium, with Galen saying that opium is the strongest of the drugs that numb the senses and produce a deadening sleep. After the fall of Rome, opium fell out of use in Europe, but stayed in the Middle East, with Avicenna's recommendations of use and dosages remaining relevant until the 18th century. Europe was reintroduced to opium in the 15th century in the form of laudanum. This didn't really refer to any specific concoction, but rather to a series of proprietary opium tinctures that just shared the same name. In religion, taking ancient Greece as an example, we can see a culture of reverence towards opium. The poppy goddess of the Cretans, associated with the harvest, would become Demeter when she was exported to the mainland. When she lost her daughter Persephone, it is said she created the opium poppy to give her sleep and a respite from her sorrow. Poppy wreaths were also associated with Hypnos, god of sleep, his brother Thanatos, god of death, and their mother Nyx, goddess of night. More famously, perhaps, Morpheus, son of Hypnos and god of dreams, is said to have slept in a cave full of poppies. Derived from his name, Friedrich Saturna called the drug he isolated from opium morphine. Nowadays, Persephone doesn't really get along with her man Hades anymore, so she uses her mom's creation to numb the pain and dullness of it all. But why does it work? Let's talk about that in Part 1. How opioids work. I don't want to make this a physiology class, so I'll try and be concise. There are certain receptors throughout our nervous system that are called, aptly enough, opioid receptors. Depending on where they are located, they have different effects. The most important one of these is called the mu-opioid receptor, or MORE. Our body stimulates this receptor primarily by producing beta endorphin. Yeah, the stuff that your body produces when you exercise. Therapeutically, the most important location of these receptors is in our spinal cord, in the neurons that transmit pain. Opioids are until now the only medication that we have to treat pain in our central nervous system, that is, in our spinal cord and our brain. Every other analgesic or painkiller works directly on the neurons that detect the pain in the periphery. The problem with this is that we also have opioid receptors in our brain, in the nucleus accumbens, which plays a significant role in reward functions and thus in addiction. Other uses of opioids are as a cough suppressant, which is why codeine is still used in cough syrup. This cough suppressing property is also the most dangerous one, since it doesn't just suppress coughing, it also suppresses breathing. Opioid overdoses are caused when breathing is suppressed so much that our brain forgets to breathe and you die of asphyxiation. Opioids are also famous for causing constipation. But that might be a property that could be pretty useful, especially if you have diarrhea. Opium was used to treat cholera and dysentery. Today we use loperamide, otherwise known as Imodium, to treat diarrhea. Now, don't go getting any ideas trying to get high off of diarrhea medication, since loperamide works primarily peripherally and only passes the blood-brain barrier at extremely high doses. I'm talking about 200 pills at once. And if that doesn't deter you, these high doses also mess with your heart and cause cardiotoxicity and death. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, it's time to get an illustrative history lesson on Part 2. Opium in colonial times. Opium was brought to China in the 7th century by Arab merchants, but it didn't really explode in popularity until the 17th century when tobacco smoking became popular and people figured out that you could also smoke opium. At the time, opium was supplied by Portuguese and Dutch merchants that would bring their wares from India. In 1729, opium smoking was banned in China. Several edicts then followed so that by the beginning of the 18th century, opium was fully outlawed. This, however, just made trade go underground. By this time, the East India Company had conquered a sizable chunk of the Indian subcontinent, and more importantly for us, they were now in control of Bengal and their poppy fields in eastern India, practically monopolizing world opium trade. Historians claim that British control over opium trade was a keystone to their empire. You'd at first think this is because of the fat stacks that it brought in, but you soon see that this was just a small part of it. If we compare opium revenue to the total revenue of India, we see that it isn't as much as we would expect. I totally thought that opium revenues must have been through the roof. And although opium was the second most important bringer of the money in the 19th century, it wasn't as important as land tax was. It seems like opium was more important to the East India Company in terms of it being a stable revenue in a profitable industry that they could show the banks so that they could keep on getting loans for their expensive territorial expansions in India. A much more important aspect as to why it was a keystone to the empire is because of a little thing called the trade triangle between Britain, India, and China. You see, the Brits really loved, and believe you me, still adore their tea. The East India Company held a monopoly of trade with India from the 7 Years' War until 1833. And the product they invested in the most on, and by the most, I mean like 90% of what was spent, was tea. Not only that, but taxes on tea made up 10% of the revenue of the British Exchequer. That is, the British Treasury. So bringing tea to the British Isles was the sole purpose of existing of the East India Company. In exchange for this tea, however, the British didn't have anything to trade the Chinese for, as shown in this letter from Emperor Qianlong to King George III in 1793.
Hitherto, all European nations, including your own country's barbarian merchants, have carried on their trade with our celestial empire at Canton. Such has been the procedure for many years, although our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its own borders. There was therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. But as the tea, silk, and porcelain which the Celestial Empire produces are absolute necessities to European nations and to yourselves, we have permitted as a single mark of favor that foreign merchant firms should be established at Canton, so that your wants might be supplied and your country thus participate in our beneficence.
That means to buy all of this tea, the British would have to bring silver all the way from the British Isles down to China. This was, as you can imagine, terribly inconvenient and bad for business. That is, until they realized how much people wanted their opium. The East India Company didn't bring the opium themselves to China. Instead, they auctioned off the opium in Calcutta to what amounted to smugglers, who would then bring the opium to China. But so that the smugglers wouldn't be inconvenienced by bringing all the silver that they gained in China to Calcutta, or in many cases all the way back to Britain, they signed a deal with the East India Company to hand over everything they gained in China over to them in exchange for bills that they could then trade for cash in London. This way, the East India Company was left with piles of cash to trade for their tea in China, so that they didn't have to bring all that silver from Britain to trade for it. All of this compounded, it allowed for the accumulation of British wealth and the further expansion and sustaining of British India, by far the most important of the colonies. This wealth produced by opium can be seen in just one example. Jardine and Matheson, a British company that got rich off of trading opium, is now a conglomerate worth over $20 billion. So when in 1838, a new imperial commissioner started to confiscate and destroy opium in Canton, the only port open to foreigners for trade, the British reacted by declaring war, and the Chinese lost what is now known as the First Opium War. This led to, among others, the cession of Hong Kong to the British in perpetuity and the opening of 4 more Chinese ports to foreign trade. Opium was not yet legalized, but that would happen when the Chinese lost the Second Opium War. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the British and Chinese signed a pact in which the British would stop exporting as much opium to China, and at the same time, China was supposed to crack down on clandestine poppy fields and opium production in its own territory. Both sides claimed it was working, with British inspectors being surprised that the Chinese were fulfilling their promise. To the rest of the world's surprise, the Brits were also keeping their end of the bargain, reducing total exports and even production in India as well. This came to a halt, however, with the beginning of World War I and the collapse of the Qing dynasty, where opium production returned with a vengeance. This would continue until the Maoists rose to power and started to execute opium producers and traffickers and even addicts willy-nilly. It is here that we have 2 differing arguments on opium use in China. The most widespread view is that China was riddled with addicts and was pumped with opium by foreign powers greedy for profits. The other is more recent and comes from a more libertarian, classical liberal view. It says that most opium smokers weren't addicts, and this addiction aspect was actually way overblown and exaggerated. Most people would only use it on special occasions or as a medicine, and there were just a few bad apples that couldn't control their use of the product.
Part 3. Opium in China. Colonialism.
Let's start with the first argument, that the colonial powers pumped China full of opium. This is definitely true until at least the middle of the 19th century, when opium was forcibly legalized in China. The problem is, my friends, that once opium is legal to import, it's also legal to produce and to tax in China. Landlords would pressure peasants into planting lots of opium because, just a little bit of it would produce great profits. On the other hand, the governments also supported planting more opium because they could tax it handsomely. These 2 things together led to an absolute explosion of opium production in China. In 1880, the total amount of opium being produced in India was around 6,000 metric tons. Most of this was then shipped off to China, which had, at this point, already caught up with India in the 30 years since opium was legalized there. The thing is that after this, in India, opium production started to decline, while in China, it exploded and quintupled in the next 25 years. In 1906, China was producing around 35,000 metric tons of opium. This added to the 5,000 metric tons that were still being imported from India. And we have a country with a population of just 400 million consuming 40,000 metric tons of opium a year. To give you just a rough comparison as to how ridiculous this amount is, in 2016, it's estimated that the total legal and illegal opium production in the world was around 10,000 metric tons. And that's for a population of 7 billion people. This shows us that it was rather the landlords and governments' addiction to the opium profits that led to this explosion in production. Funnily enough, opium in China followed an eerily similar course to tea in Britain. First introduced as a medicinal panacea and as a luxury item for the upper classes, Both were too expensive for anybody but the nobility to be able to consume recreationally, the lower classes reserving it only as medicine. Then, with increased importation, the prices of both of them fell to the point that now the affluent middle classes could afford it recreationally. Where tea prices continued to drop simply due to the East India Company's monopoly on Chinese tea trade, opium almost surely arrived to the masses only after the opening of China in the Second Opium War, at which point the Chinese were able to start producing their own opium. British tea production in India didn't start to compete with Chinese imports until the end of the 19th century, at which point tea was already an established hallmark at all levels of British society. The second difference between them is that while tea is a mild stimulant that helped workers stay awake during their grueling shifts in industrializing Britain, opium is a depressant with extreme euphoric and physiologically addicting properties. Part 4. Opium in China. Dikötter, a measured response. The second theory that we're going to discuss today, that barely anyone was addicted to opium and the issues with opium in China are way overblown, is a bit more loaded and needs some unpacking. In my opinion, this oversimplified view is harmful for anybody trying to understand opioids or drugs in general. I found a particularly egregious article by Frank Dikötter, a Dutch historian specializing in Chinese history, called Unravelling the Myth of China's Opium Trade. I also know that he has a book where he goes more deeply into the topic and I imagine fleshes out some of his arguments, but due to Corona shenanigans, I have not been able to get my hands on a copy. I ordered one like a month ago, but it still hasn't arrived, and since I can also not find any PDFs online, there's nothing I can do. Once I get my hands on a copy, I'll read through it, and if there's anything I feel needs responding to, I'll make an addendum to this video, and you can see that if it ever comes out. Part 4.1. The word mild's doing some legwork there, Frank. So the first point he makes is that there's a lack of medical evidence about the impact of the drug on the health of its consumers, bar mild constipation. A more petty person might say, well, yeah, unless you consider it dying an impact on health. However, he isn't completely wrong here. Chronic opioid use will not kill you unless you overdose on it. Unlike, let's say, chronic alcohol use, which will almost surely kill you due to its own toxicity. We also have to look at withdrawal syndrome. Well, alcohol withdrawal can kill you due to its own merits because of seizures and acute autonomic failure. Opioid withdrawal doesn't kill you directly, but rather the acute diarrhea and vomiting caused by opioid withdrawal can lead to dehydration, which can then lead to heart failure, which then leads to death. My problem with this intro, however, is when he says that opium doesn't cause any problems, bar mild constipation. The word mild is doing some f***ing legwork there. The constipation caused by opioid use can become so bad that you have intense stomach pains. What do you do when opium is the only medicine you have against stomach pain? Well, people would end up taking more opium. Not only that, but opioids also have a bimodal modulation of pain. So that, sure, if you activate these opioid receptors, you will mostly get the analgesic pain relieving effects, but it can also have the exact opposite effect, where you get a hyperalgesia, that is, a hypersensitivity to pain. This lowers your pain threshold so that something that shouldn't cause any pain suddenly makes you howl in agony. Think about how a sunburn makes, the mere action of touching your skin make it feel like someone's poking you with a hot iron. This hyperalgesic effect is normally only activated at higher doses, which is normally fine because the analgesic effect, the pain-killing effect, also increases at higher doses. But that only counts with normal regulation of your opioid receptor. With chronic opioid use, your body reduces the expression of the pain-relieving effects, while at the same time sensitizing the hyperalgesic effects. Combine both of these mechanisms in our poor schmuck who's trying to relieve the stomach pain caused by opium constipation by taking even more opium. And instead of the pain relief he's waiting for, the pain gets way worse because of the increased pain sensitivity and the increased constipation. So this oversimplified comment made at the beginning of Dikötter's article required me to take it apart in this amount of detail. Part 4.2, Eating versus Smoking. At one point, Dikötter talks about how smoking was generally acknowledged to be more wasteful than ingestion, although morphine content reached the bloodstream more quickly and caused a rush. Smoking is more wasteful than eating. It depends on the passive diffusion of the substance from the smoke in the lungs to the bloodstream. This means that most of the substance does not get absorbed, and it's very inefficient to take it this way. Not only that, but 30% of the air that you take in a normal breath stays in what's called the dead space of your airways, where no gas exchange takes place. On the other hand, when you ingest a substance, it has your entire digestive tract to slowly be absorbed through a mechanism that is explicitly made to absorb as much as possible from whatever is being ingested. Smoking is also safer than eating opium, exactly because when you stop smoking, there's no more opium to be pumped into your bloodstream. Once eaten, the morphine in the opium will continue to be pumped into your bloodstream until it's past the small intestine. Unless, let's say, you've taken some active coal which traps the morphine and doesn't let it be absorbed. So you might smoke too much opium but then pass out and still continue to breathe. But if you eat it, the morphine will continue to be pumped into your bloodstream far past the point of you passing out until your heart stops due to asphyxiation. There is a problem, however, when Dikötter talks about how when being smoked, opium causes a rush. You see, smoking is more wasteful, but it has its advantages to eating it. Whatever amount of morphine that your lungs might have absorbed will go straight to your brain and bind to the opioid receptors and cause a rush. As soon as this happens, your brain will start to downregulate the opioid and dopamine receptors that caused that rush. That means that smoking opium increases its addictive properties. Eating opium, on the other hand, would give you a slower, steadier stream of morphine to your blood. Not only that, but there's a thing called the first pass effect, where everything that's being absorbed by your intestines first has to go through the liver, which gives it a chance to deactivate some of the morphine being absorbed, so that not everything that is absorbed will actually have the chance to get to your brain and do something there. This leads us to the main point of Dikötter's essay. Part 4.3. Opium as a medical panacea. Dikötter's main point in his article is that opium was mostly used as an affordable, do-it-all medicine, a so-called panacea, to treat everything from headaches to dysentery. This may have been true before opium's legalization in China, when it was just too expensive to be anything more than a medicine, but Dikötter has a serious problem equating pre-legalization China with post-legalization China. After legalization, opium was widely available for everybody to use as they pleased, and use it people did. To be fair, he does acknowledge that opium descended the social ladder from the wealthy to the poor and then became popular recreationally. However, he ignores how pervasive opium use was in China. 40,000 metric tons of opium will not smoke themselves if most people are just irregular users of the product. Conclusion: the problem with opium. Unsurprisingly, the real problem with opium is the capitalism of it all. Opium's healing and addictive properties assure producers of returning customers. This is the reason why opium production was expanded and streamlined in India in the first place towards the beginning of the 19th century. The price of opium remained relatively high in China after its legalization towards the middle of the 19th century. But landowners soon figured out that they could make more money by harvesting opium than they could harvesting food. So they forced the peasants leasing their land to do so. Due to its taxation, local governments also encouraged its production. Both of these things combined lead to an increased supply and a drop in prices, so that the poor sections of society now have easy access to the product. The poor sections of society are the ones most vulnerable to opium's addictive properties. It provides relief to the monotonous and dreary life that peasants and factory workers are subjected to. Most people that self-medicate are highly functional. Life doesn't give them pleasure, but opium does. So these workers and peasants might even be encouraged to smoke because productivity will rise if they have something to look forward to. In Victorian England and in the US, we saw something very similar happen to housewives. Popularly prescribed to treat menstrual cramps, opium soon became a way for these women to escape the monotony of their lives, and soon they had to take it every day or face the withdrawal effects. It is possible to wean yourself off of opium, but if most of the joy in your life and even your will to live derive themselves from taking opium or smoking it, why would you stop? In China, the section of the population that had the biggest percentage of documented opium smokers were businessmen. The stress caused by the system they were submitted to led them to try and find an edge over their competition in any way possible. Opium provided relief and a steady hand in the cutthroat world of business in 19th century China. Speaking of a steady hand, in his book, Our Right to Drugs, Thomas Szasz talks about how William Halsted might not have become America's most celebrated surgeon and one of the stars of the Johns Hopkins Medical School had he not been able to medicate himself with morphine whenever he felt the need for it. Is this the world we want for ourselves, though? Where the stress of it all becomes so much that in our free time we need to take drugs to cope? William Halsted definitely revolutionized surgery in the 19th century, but he didn't have to give his entire life, everything he had, to medicine. Productivity decreases the more we push a human being past a certain point. And if this is the case, what if Halsted had lived in a world where he hadn't been seen as a machine that just needed some oiling every once in a while in the form of morphine to keep it going? How much would we have actually lost? And how much more would Halsted have gained as a human being? That was very long. Ugh. As you can see, I left out quite a few topics. Importantly, I've left out the purification of opium to morphine and all of the 20th century and the entire war on drugs. If you are interested in my sources or any further reading on the topic, please check out the description below. I have listed out all my sources. There's quite a few. That is it from me today. I hope you look as fabulous as I do in a flower crown.